welcome to this talk. This coincides, was part of the exhibition of James Smetham works at Bewdley in the gallery of the Bewdley Museum. Small gallery, but they are quite small works, as Christiana, I think, will probably mention. And you can see some of it behind me. So we decided to move this online as it would. We had inquiries will make this go to a wider audience, and I think that's proved the result. We've already had two successful online events in conjunction with this exhibition, and we hope that this will be a third successful one. Christiana has said that there will be time, and we're happy to take questions and have discussion for some time at the end of the talk. I should also say that we are recording it, but and then it will go online at a later stage. But the recording will only be of the lecture. It won't include the discussion. So if that's all clear and there are no questions, and I think Daniel is muting you all centrally, then Christiana, welcome. Christiana is a colleague whom I've known for quite a few years now from Oxford Brookes University, an art historian. And so thank you very much for agreeing to give this talk, Christiana. And among various achievements in her life, several books and so on, but also curated, her specialism is the Pre-Raphaelites, and she curated the exhibition of the Pre-Raphaelites in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, which had two runs, didn't it?
Yeah.
One just after the pandemic, and then another one, a repeat last year, both of which were very popular, did well. So thank you very much indeed. Christiana, you've got the title in front of you, so over to you.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. Right, thank you very much, Peter, and thank you all for joining in with this talk. I'm sorry not to be giving it in person, but it's nice to reach people who may be a long way away. So that's one reason why we decided to change it. I should say that I planned this talk as being for an audience in Bewdley, and so I didn't assume that people would know a lot about Smetham or even about Pre-Raphaelites. But I now begin to realize there may be some people who do know a lot about both, and so I apologize if I'm telling you things you already know. So, James Smetham and his contemporaries. James Smetham was a naturally gifted artist. He was very intelligent, widely read, a person of strong and intense feeling. He was born into a Methodist family. His father, his brother, two uncles, three cousins, and two brothers-in-law were Wesleyan Methodist ministers or lay preachers, and he himself took a Bible class every week. As he described it, he had a feeling for art and natural beauty at an early age. And once he started drawing with a box of watercolours at the age of 8, he was determined to be a painter. He was born in Yorkshire in 1821, but it was only in 1843, when he was 22, that he began serious art training, which was quite late by the standards of the time. Before then, he had copied prints and worked in an architect's office, and he'd painted portraits. In 1843, however, he studied at Carey's Drawing School in London and became a probationer at the Royal Academy schools there, which is the place where all ambitious artists wanted to train. But he failed to be accepted as a student. He had a nervous breakdown, and he only recovered after his father died in 1847. From that time, he had modest success, exhibiting some works at the Royal Academy and elsewhere, and selling his works, mainly to fellow Methodists. He worked as a teacher of drawing at the Wesleyan Normal School, Westminster, where his wife Sarah also taught. This was a post that he held for 26 years, from 1851 to 1877, teaching drawing for 4 hours a week. I'm showing you here a selection of his works, and I'm going to come to each of them separately later on. But this is just putting them all together to show what an extraordinary range he had. He worked in a variety of styles and subject matter. He did portraits, landscapes, illustrations to the Bible, and to literature and genre painting. What all his works have in common is a thoughtful, dreamy, poetic tone. Smetham was plagued by mental illness throughout his life. He recognized that he lacked the professional environment that was needed to make a success in art. From 1856 until his mental state meant he could live at home no longer, he and his wife Sarah lived at Stoke Newington, which in those days was a village a long way out of London, and they eventually had 6 children. He had another breakdown in 1857, and a final one from which he never recovered in 1877. Methodism had a huge effect on his life. It emphasized the importance of biblical study, fasting, and prayer. In 1848, Smetham invented a method of recording his thoughts, which he called monumentalism. He wrote, "Instead of letting ideas die, I build to each a lasting monument." In his journals and in some of his books, most notably his Bible, he made thousands of tiny sketches, which he called his squarings. Between 1851 and 1871, he squared, as he put it, all 31,102 verses in the 66 books of the Bible, making several every day. And he said he found that squaring calmed his body, mind, and spirit, so it was a sort of therapy. He also used squaring to record daily events in his own life, as you can see in the slide here on the left, with notes that are quite often very difficult to interpret. He wrote that squaring was a way of preserving a fugitive conception that consumes no time, wastes no money, and piles no unfinished canvases against the wall. As well as making these drawings, he would write down his thoughts and collect them in little handmade notebooks, which he would then send off to his friends. And these he called his ventilators. With these 2 devices, the squaring and the ventilators, he was able to record everything he thought about, everything that happened to him, both in visual and in written form. As an artist, Smetham was essentially self-taught. Once he got to London, he made good use of the annual exhibitions, and he was also very good at picking up ideas from the artists he met. While preparing for the Royal Academy schools, he met John Rogers Herbert, a Roman Catholic convert and painter of biblical subjects, and you can see a painting by Herbert on the left. And he would also have had some instruction from Richard Redgrave, whose painting you see on the right. Redgrave was a visiting professor at Carey's school. If you wanted to be more than a portrait painter, and Smetham evidently did, the 2 main areas to pursue were history painting and genre painting. The successful history painter, like Herbert, required a long training in drawing the human figure and a continuing use of life models. Both posed great difficulties for Smetham. He would have drawn sculpture at Carey's and at the Royal Academy, but he may never have done any life drawing at all. Later on, he could not afford models, found them difficult to come by in Stoke Newington, or perhaps felt uncomfortable drawing from them. Genre painting, on the other hand, required a careful study of interiors, of costume, of expression, an ability to tell a story, and preferably one that would be similar to those in contemporary novels. Genre painters tended to be quite sort of light-hearted in their approach, and Smetham was perhaps too serious to be successful in this type of painting. But he certainly tried. His painting, The Dream, which you see on the right, and which is regarded by some as his finest work, adopts some of Redgrave's techniques, but it adds a supernatural element, with an ectoplasmic figure gesturing towards a ship on a stormy sea. However, contemporary viewers wanted to have read this picture as it was a sort of novel, so perhaps less interested in the suggestion of a spirit world than in the story. So what's happening here? Is this a woman whose husband is away at sea? Has he been lost at sea? Is this his ghost coming back to tell her what's happened? And so on. Smetham found it more congenial to paint illustrations to the Bible. This one on the right is Counting the Cost from 1855. It began as one of the little tiny squaring drawings. It was actually accepted and hung at the Royal Academy exhibition in 1855, and it refers to one of Christ's parables about the cost of becoming a disciple. I think you can see echoes of Herbert's style here, but there are also some awkwardnesses in the drawing and the perspective. However, it was well received. The art journal noticed it as showing independence and a desire for originality. Smetham could be a very sensitive portrait painter, as we can see from the portrait of his wife and son on the right, which is at the Bewdley exhibition. He himself said that he gave up portraiture after the 1840s because of the competition of photography. But he evidently continued to do the occasional portrait. This one on the left, Anna Kull, is of a German violin cellist who made her debut in London in 1857, aged just 15. Instead of the dark background of conventional portraits, Smetham placed her in a light-filled interior. The painting is small, however, for a full-length portrait. It's just 30 inches high. I think he might have been inspired by a recent portrait by George Frederick Watts of Lady Dalrymple, the sister of the photographer Julia Margaret Cameron. The portrait of Anna Kull by Smetham was shown at the Royal Academy in 1858. With its bright, clear colours, its fine detail, and its suggestion of sunlight, it looks remarkably pre-Raphaelite. In autumn 1848, at a time when Smetham was just starting to resume his career after his first breakdown, 7 young artists got together in London and founded the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And I'm showing you pictures of the 3 most important and then the names of the others. They were strong personalities. Millet was the most naturally gifted of them. Holman Hunt was the most earnest, and Dante Gabriel Rossetti the most complicated. Rossetti was Anglo-Italian. He was a poet. He was a brother of the poet Christina. He was the son of a Dante scholar, and he was himself obsessed by Dante. Woolner was a sculptor. F.G. Stevens and W.M. Rossetti both became important art critics. James Collinson was a not very successful painter who resigned from the Brotherhood in 1850, saying it was no longer compatible with his faith as a Roman Catholic. The artists were drawn together by their dissatisfaction with the teaching methods of the Royal Academy and their dislike of the popular art of their time. They looked back to the art before Raphael, believing that the earlier artists had been more sincere and more scrupulous in their study of nature, hence their choice of name. Rossetti was probably the one that brought up the idea of a secret society with 7 members. His father had connections with revolutionary groups in Italy. The Pre-Raphaelites did indeed revolutionize British painting. In the first instance, they did this by painting sunny pictures directly from nature and often out of doors, using bright colours on white grounds. Their work would have appealed to Smetham because they wanted to paint serious subjects, themes from important religious and literary texts, or else from British history. They thought a lot of the painting of their own day was just frivolous. Holman Hunt's picture on the left, a converted British family, was shown at the Royal Academy in 1850, and Millet's picture, Ophelia, was shown in 1852. Rossetti, however, took a different path, almost from the beginning. After attempting to paint in oils from nature, he began to specialise in small watercolours, working mainly from his imagination, using rich and subtle colours that suggested a medieval atmosphere. As I've said, his father was a Dante scholar and named his son after the poet. And Rossetti himself was obsessed by Dante, and especially by his hopeless love for Beatrice. This is Dante drawing an angel on the anniversary of Beatrice's death. Romantic love and female beauty were important themes for the Pre-Raphaelites generally, but particularly for Rossetti. Rossetti disliked exhibiting in public after a few bad experiences at the outset, and he was able to support himself by working for a small circle of admirers. Smetham saw the works of the group at Royal Academy exhibitions. In 1854, he came in contact with them more directly when he attended the Working Men's College. Here he met Dante Gabriel Rossetti and also the art critic John Ruskin, a great defender of the Pre-Raphaelites. The Working Men's College was set up by a group of Christian socialists to provide a liberal education for skilled artisans. Rossetti and Ruskin taught drawing there, and we know that Ruskin was delighted to meet Smetham, whose artistic and intellectual gifts he recognised at once. John Ruskin was born in 1819, so he's nearly the same age as Smetham, just 2 years older. His father was a successful sherry merchant who'd made enough money to collect art, and his mother was a devout evangelical Christian. Both of them doted on their only child, and they took him with them on regular holidays around Scotland, England, Wales, France, Germany, Switzerland, and Italy. In the mid-1840s, Ruskin became famous for his book, Modern Painters, which is a passionate defense of J.M.W. Turner against the critics of his time. It eventually ran to 5 volumes and was enormously influential. Literally everybody in the art world and beyond read it. Modern Painters is eloquently written and it's deeply religious. It advocates close study of nature because, as Ruskin said, the natural world is the work of God. In 1851, with his idol Turner coming to the end of his life, Ruskin threw in his lot with the Pre-Raphaelites and defended them against their critics. He said that they had followed his advice to go to nature and to copy it faithfully. But in reality, Pre-Raphaelitism was very varied and had both a realistic and an imaginative side to it. Ruskin himself was torn between these two aspects. He preached realism because of his belief in the divine in nature, and he began by admiring Millet and Hunt. Yet later on, he patronized artists who were inclined more to the imaginative and poetic side, including Rossetti and also Edward Burne-Jones. As I said, Ruskin took to Smetham immediately. Smetham showed him his drawings, and Ruskin wrote him a remarkable letter saying that he was amazed by his talent, his industry, and his thoughtfulness. Ruskin asked Smetham for an account of his life. This is an important document as it describes his education and his work in the architect's office. In this account, Smetham makes the significant remark that, quote, "With artists generally, I have not felt much drawn to associate." This was a real barrier to his professional advancement, since so much depended on making contacts and exchanging ideas with fellow artists. In a later letter in 1864, Smetham admitted that to be successful, artists needed to, quote, "live for years in an intense professional atmosphere, to frequent sketching clubs, lecture rooms, the company of dealers and patrons, all things he described as utterly revolting and impossible to me." So he was torn really between two worlds, the earnest aesthetic world of the Methodist Bible class on the one hand, and the seductive, pleasure-seeking world of contemporary art. Smetham's dream of 1855 surely reflects his admiration for Millet's Ophelia, with its arched top, which is typical of early Pre-Raphaelite works, its overall composition, and its very detailed foreground. But it doesn't have the insistent natural detail of Millet's painting, which was executed by a stream in Surrey in the summer of 1851. Smetham did attempt the complete Pre-Raphaelite out-of-doors mode once, in a very small painting of Naboth and his vineyard, with a jealous Ahab spying on him from above, top left. Here he is following Holman Hunt in painting in sunlight on a white ground with bright colours and intense detail. The rosy-cheeked figures and the vine leaves are an obvious tribute to Hunt's painting of a converted British family. The surprising composition for the tiny Ahab in the top left-hand corner is also derived from Hunt. But Smetham's painting is only 9 inches high. In some respects, the devout evangelical Holman Hunt was the Pre-Raphaelite Smetham should have been closest to, but he found Hunt's method of painting very difficult and didn't continue with it. Naboth in his vineyard was rejected by the Royal Academy, but it was accepted and shown in the annual exhibition at the Liverpool Academy, where Smetham and the Pre-Raphaelites generally found a more sympathetic reception. It was Dante Gabriel Rossetti, however, whom Smetham found most congenial. Rossetti hated exposing his works to public criticism in exhibitions. In the 1850s, he was painting poetic watercolours, taking subjects from the Bible, from his favourite poet and namesake Dante, and from the Arthurian legends. Smetham's painting, The Wedding of Sir Gawain, which you see on the right, is a very similar kind of subject, suggesting a chivalrous world of heroic knights and delicate ladies, although it is actually an oil rather than a watercolour. Like much of Smetham's work, it is small, just 9 inches high. Rossetti found faithful patrons, and his reputation spread by word of mouth. He hadn't had much academic training. He got rather impatient with it, and he preferred to draw from his imagination rather than making systematic use of life models. Now, Smetham, as well as being an artist and a poet, could write most beautifully about art. He could have been a very successful art historian or art critic. He described the painting on the left, The Wedding of St. George, as like a golden dim dream, Love credulous all gold, gold armour, a sense of secret enclosure in palace chambers far apart, but quaint chambers in quaint places, where angels creep in through sliding panel doors and stand behind rows of flowers, drumming on golden bells with wings crimson. This description comes in a letter to a friend in 1860, and it actually incorporates two quotations, one from Milton's translation of Horace and one from Tennyson's poem The Sleeping Beauty, which is an indication not just of Smetham's literary abilities, but also of his wide reading. Both Rossetti and Smetham were very literary. They admired each other's poetry, and they clearly got on very well, despite their very different lifestyles. Rossetti's socializing began in the evening, at a time when Smetham would normally have been going to bed, and Rossetti did not share Smetham's Christian faith. He does seem to have respected it, though, perhaps even envied it. In the 1860s, Rossetti found a lucrative line with his half-length portraits in oil of beautiful women, what he called his stunners. He dressed his models in sumptuous costumes and placed them in exotic settings with flowers and musical instruments, producing paintings that appeal to the senses of touch and hearing as well as sight. And these paintings are also sexually provocative. Rather surprisingly, Smetham executed one very successful painting in this genre, the mandolin. In the 1860s, it was arranged that Smetham should spend every Wednesday in Rossetti's studio, paint there all day, spend the evenings with Rossetti and his friends, and stay overnight. William Davis, Smetham's biographer, says that this went on for 5 years, from 1863 to 1868. I think this is a bit of an exaggeration, but there are letters in which Rossetti writes about our standing commitment, so it obviously was a definite arrangement for a time. By this time, Smetham was living at Stoke Newington with his wife and children. It was a nice, peaceful village, but in those days it was a long way out of London. Smetham had to stay overnight with somebody if he was to go to any of the evening gatherings of the artists. And people from the art world rarely went out to Stoke Newington. On one occasion, Rossetti and Ford Madox Brown planned to visit the Smethams in the evening, but Rossetti wrote, "I fear we shall not get to you till about 10, as the distance is so great." I can imagine that Sarah Smetham, who by this time had several small children, would not have been too thrilled at this prospect of these artists turning up at 10 in the evening. So this was a handicap for Smetham. It is very likely then that the mandolin was painted in Rossetti's studio. It used to be attributed to both artists together. Dealers probably would have felt that this would enhance its monetary value. But in December 2017, it came on the market, and scholars who examined it could find no trace of Rossetti's hand in the flesh painting. So it was sold as by Smetham alone. And despite this, it fetched a very high price. The estimate was £100,000 to £150,000, but it sold for £476,750. Smetham would have been so pleased if he'd known about that. Smetham evidently used some of Rossetti's studio props, including the swansdown garment that we also see in the blue bower in the centre here. On this occasion, he also borrowed one of Rossetti's models, Ellen Smith, who also appears in Rossetti's Joli Coeur, which is the painting on the right. But Smetham's painting is less blatantly sexy than Rossetti's works. The woman in the mandolin retains her dignity and her mystery, and the materials in the background are painted with great skill. The mandolin is a wonderful painting, but it is an exercise in another artist's style. And like much of its work, it was sold to a Methodist patron, James Engelbert Banner. Smetham seems to have had some difficulty in settling down and establishing a definite style of his own, and also in breaking out from the patronage of fellow Methodists, which was something that gave him a lot of support, but which he may have felt was a limitation. He was living a curious kind of double life. He was obviously excited by the creative atmosphere of what he calls the charmed circle of Rossetti and his friends. But at the same time, he was completely committed to the Methodist milieu of his Bible class, with his swearings and his ventilations. A passage in a letter that Smetham wrote in 1867 is revealing. He wrote, "Rossetti and his set are masters and great ones, and they respect what religious utterance it is wise to give, and to never show a symptom of scorn. But they are pagans, and they almost seem at times to be without even the perception of morality. Through Rossetti, Smetham also met Edward Burne-Jones. Burne-Jones originally intended to enter the church. Like Smetham, he hadn't had the usual academic training. He came to Rossetti for instruction in the 1850s after finishing his degree at Oxford, and he learned by copying Dürer prints. He was also taken up by Ruskin. Both Rossetti and Ruskin admired his powers of invention and his poetic subjects, and respected his humble background. Burne-Jones was especially interested in Arthurian subjects and the whole romance of the Middle Ages with its knights and ladies. When he started out, he had some trouble drawing the human figure. His wonderful pen and ink drawing on the left, The Knight's Farewell, is an amazing piece of work. But when you look closely at the figures and try and imagine what they would look like if they didn't have clothes on, you can see that some of the anatomy is a bit weird. Drawing was also an issue for Smetham. When his etchings were published in the 1860s, F.G. Stevens, the art critic who was one of the original Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, wrote in the Athenaeum that Smetham had genuine ability, but it needed to be disciplined and educated. He singled out this etching on the right, The Death of Earl Siward, as a work in which, he said, the drawing ruins a capital design. Stevens thought that Smetham had lots of good ideas and a feeling for expression and composition, but that many of his figures were, quote, ridiculously ill-drawn and marvellously ill-proportioned. Rossetti was horrified with this review, and he wrote to Smetham to reassure him. However, in his reply, Smetham admitted that many of the figures were done by guesswork, and he hardly used a model for them. Burne-Jones was also lucky in that he met Ruskin while he was still a young man. Ruskin paid for him to go to Italy to study art and gave him commissions to copy paintings while he was there. Smetham, by contrast, was tied down by his Methodist teaching and also by his family responsibilities, and he never went abroad. He would have been quite an anxious traveller in any case, I think. Smetham's later work shows the continuing influence of Burne-Jones. Rose of Dawn, which is in the Bewdley exhibition, is comparable to works by Burne-Jones, such as The Evening Star on the right. In each case, you've got these ethereal figures in fantasy landscapes. Smetham also learned from Millet. He obviously had quite a lot of admiration for Millet, but he was also rather cynical about the great success that Millet had had. Two works in the Bewdley exhibition can be compared with Millet's pen and ink drawings for their successful management of light and dark. The Last Sleep, bottom right, is another of the etchings and was much admired by Ruskin. The top right one, which is called That Beadsman Old, and it's an oil painting, it takes its title from the Keats poem, The Eve of St. Agnes, which was a favourite with the Pre-Raphaelites, as does Millet's painting here on the left. In That Beadsman Old, the rows of recumbent figures on their tombs recall Smetham's time in the architect's office, when he was allowed to draw all the monuments in Lincoln Cathedral. So Smetham admired Millet and Hunt and Burne-Jones, but it was always Rossetti to whom he was closest. He wrote in 1866, "Rossetti has done me more artistic good than all other art influences put together. All he does is so full of beauty." Rossetti's letters, those that survive, tell the story of a remarkable friendship. He evidently took Smetham under his wing. He advised him on the size of his paintings, saying he should make them larger, and he also advised him on the best way to appeal to dealers and patrons. In a letter in 1865, Rossetti asks them to drop formalities, as he says they are almost 10-year-old friends. In the same year, he says he looks on Smetham as, quote, "a man who cannot but give as much as he takes in intercourse with anyone, and that no one who has learnt to know you well could fail to be, as I am, affectionately yours." So you get this sense that he was really very, very fond of Smetham, although they were so different. In his letters, Rossetti says he always finds Smetham's society congenial and refreshing. And although the first time he was sent one of the ventilators, he had to point out to Smetham that he didn't have that sort of religious faith. Later on, he even appreciated the ventilators, because he says they admit the usual draft of vigorous thought and wholesome sincerity. I suspect that Smetham adapted them to suit Rossetti and didn't put so much of the religious stuff in them. The letters also show that the two men shared a sense of fun. Several letters mention caricatures and cartoons that Smetham had sent. And Rossetti teased his friend, writing on one occasion that William Bell Scott had asked him to add that he is glad your Methodism has not effaced your humour. Methodists, of course, had the reputation of being rather straight-laced, po-faced. Rossetti took a particularly great interest in the painting Smetham regarded as his masterpiece, The Hymn of the Last Supper, and he went to extraordinary lengths to get it noticed by his fellow artists and by the critics. This is a painting that was finished by the spring of 1869, and Rossetti writes to Smetham about inviting George Frederick Watts, Frederick Leighton, and William Graham either to come to dinner to meet Smetham or else to come over during the day to see the painting by daylight in Rossetti's studio. The painting is quite large for Smetham, measuring 2 by 3 feet. Leighton and Watts were fellow painters who were involved in hanging the Royal Academy exhibition that year, and they ensured that the picture was placed in the best position on the line. William Graham was a patron of Burne-Jones, and he did actually buy some paintings by Smetham, although not this one. Rossetti also wrote to his friend Frederick George Stevens, the art critic of the Athenaeum, who'd been so critical of Smetham's drawing earlier on, and he asked Stevens to take a good look at the painting. He wrote, "It is a very remarkable work by a man who will yet do things to be talked about, although hitherto he has worked chiefly on a very small scale and hardly exhibited anything at all." He tells Stevens that the painting illustrates the passage in the Bible, in the Gospel according to St. Matthew. When they'd sung a hymn, they went up to the Mount of Olives. Rossetti pointed out that the subject had never been painted before, and that it was novel to show the disciples standing rather than sitting round the table. Rossetti went on to say, Judas is shown lingering outside the door in the lamplight. I mean, you can see him here on the right, hardly daring to go on his deadly errand. The simplicity of its high emotion, concluded Rossetti, reminds me of nothing but the early Italians. And this, of course, was high praise indeed, because the early Italians were the artists the Pre-Raphaelites admired most. Smetham sold the painting before the Royal Academy exhibition even opened for 300 guineas, which was a good price. The buyer was James S. Budgett, a Methodist friend who bought many of his works. And it was noticed by the critics. But alongside the favourable reviews, there was one in the Art Journal that was downright mean, perhaps from a critic who knew about Rossetti's attempts to drum up support for Smetham. This critic said that the painting was, quote, offensive. He or she accused the artist of affectation and said that Smetham should stick to a humbler walk of art. There may have been some social snobbery and anti-Methodist feeling behind this review, as Methodists were known for their singing of hymns. This review must have been a blow to Smetham. We don't know exactly how he responded to it, I don't think. And he didn't have any further works accepted by the Royal Academy. But Rossetti managed to persuade some non-Methodist patrons to buy his work. And Smetham remained ambitious, or if anything, even more ambitious. In 1871, he sent 2 paintings to the Royal Academy, each of which were 5 feet wide. One was entitled Hesper, and the other one, The Women of the Crucifixion. But both were rejected. Both were bought, however, by the faithful James Budgett. These repeated rejections drove Smetham eventually to another nervous breakdown in 1877, from which he never recovered. He spent his final years in mental institutions and died in 1889. Even after Smetham's collapse, Rossetti, who was not in great shape himself, did all he could to help Sarah Smetham sell the remaining work, so he remained a very loyal friend to Smetham. Now, as I said, Smetham's work is very varied, but he was perhaps most himself in a series of small works in a horizontal format, poetic pastoral landscapes. Here, his influences are not so much the Pre-Raphaelites, or this one is quite like Burne-Jones in many respects, as another group of artists who specialised in rural and seaside scenes. And those are John Linnell, Samuel Palmer, and James Clark Hook. In these works, sometimes in watercolour, sometimes in oil, Smetham produces lovely effects of light. His favourite time of day was twilight, a time of softened forms and evocative colours, very different from the strong sunshine of early Pre-Raphaelitism. This one, a subject from a Tennyson poem, is in the current exhibition at Bewdley, while this is a Shakespearean subject. In Shakespeare's play Cymbeline, the two men who mourn the death of Imogen are hunters rather than shepherds, and the text says that she is disguised as a boy, so Smetham has not been very faithful to his source. But he is true to Imogen's recognition of the tenderness of the pair. Their simple expressions of grief are proof to her that fine feeling can exist outside the refined circles of the court. At this point in the story, Imogen is not actually dead. She has only taken a sleeping draught from which she soon awakes. So all these works are the same sort of format, almost panoramic in format. This one has no specific literary source, but they're all small. It evokes the world of pastoral poetry in which shepherds and shepherdesses have time to flirt while they pipe to their sheep. In works like this one, Smetham is close to the world of the landscape painter John Linnell and his son-in-law Samuel Palmer. We know that Smetham used to visit Linnell at his home in Surrey, and that Linnell even asked Smetham to be his biographer and literary executor, but he declined. There's no evidence of any direct contact between Palmer and Smetham, but Smetham would have seen Palmer's works at exhibitions. In an essay on William Blake, which was published in 1869, Smetham wrote of, quote, Samuel Palmer, whose profoundly poetic watercolour landscapes are still to be seen year by year on the walls of the Old Watercolour Society. And so here you've got a comparison between Smetham down at the bottom and then John Linnell on the left and Samuel Palmer on the right. And I can think you can see there's not just common subject matter, but also common treatment of it. All three artists shared an enthusiasm for the art and poetry of William Blake. Linnell and Palmer had known Blake when he was an old man, and Rossetti admired Smetham's essay on Blake so much that he included it in the 1880 edition of Alexander Gilchrist's Life of Blake. In this same volume, Rossetti described Smetham as more akin to Blake than any other living artist, and his special imaginative form of landscape as often nearly allied by landscape intensity to Samuel Palmer. So this was more high praise for him. This work, Piping Down the Valleys Wild, takes its title from Blake's introduction to his Songs of Innocence. And you can see the lines there. Although I don't find that Smetham's work is very much like Blake's in its style, but they obviously shared this huge admiration for Blake, who, like Rossetti, was both a poet and a painter. Palmer and Smetham shared a feeling for the poetic possibilities of twilight, the time of day when agricultural workers and their animals returned to the comforts of home. Palmer's etching on the left, The Weary Ploughman, would have been readily available to Smetham. His own watercolour, Going Home, on the right, has a similar subject and composition, although Palmer's work is very much more elaborate. Smetham evidently identified with the lonely, weary pilgrim that he depicts. Another artist who is not mentioned in Smetham's letters and diaries, but seems to have been an influence, was James Clark Hook. He became famous for his pictures of fisherfolk and coastal scenes. Palmer and Hook both belonged to the Etching Club, which was established in 1838. This was another mutually supportive artist group that Smetham might have joined, since he had a great interest in etching, but he never did. John Linnell, Samuel Palmer, and James Clark Hook were all devout. Linnell was a nonconformist and eventually joined the Plymouth Brethren. Palmer was an Anglican, and Hook was a Methodist. So they might actually have been better companions for Smetham than Rossetti. But Hook and Linnell lived in the countryside, and Palmer was a bit of a recluse. And also they were all landscape painters. Smetham produced small imaginative landscapes, but he didn't really make the systematic studies that were necessary for success in this area of art. Another work that is similar to Hook's is the painting and etching of Hugh Miller watching for his father's boat. Hugh Miller was the son of a shipmaster, and his father died in shipwreck when he was 5. So this subject has tragic undertones that you wouldn't necessarily recognize just by looking at it. He was also a very interesting character. Hugh Miller trained as a stonemason, got interested in geology, and went on to become a very famous scientist and author of best-selling books. He was an evangelical Christian and suffered from mental illness, which led to his suicide in 1856, at the age of 54. There were many reasons, therefore, why Smetham would identify him on a personal level. But this was also a subject that would be of great interest to a wider audience because his death was fairly recent and his story well known. In 1862, Smetham took as his subject another figure who had achieved great things from humble beginnings. Cadman was the 7th century writer of the first recorded poem in England, which is now known as Cadman's Hymn. So we've got hymns again. Cadman was an illiterate cowman, miraculously endowed, apparently, with the power to sing. Smetham's painting shows him playing to Hilda, Abbess of Whitby, and 2 of her nuns. The story of this painting is instructive. A larger version was sold to Smetham's Methodist patron, James Engelbert Vanner. Having bought it, however, he kept it out of sight because of what he called its conventual element, that is, the presence of nuns, which Methodists did not approve of. In 1877, he had the abbess and the nuns cut off so that only the figure of Cadman remained. It may be, therefore, that Vanner bought Smetham's work primarily as a way of supporting a fellow Methodist, because Methodists were explicitly encouraged to buy from Methodist tradespeople, rather than because he actually admired the paintings. And Vanner also bought the mandolin, and I just wonder what he might have done with that. I imagine that Smetham, with his admiration for Rossetti, would actually have been very proud of his beautiful nuns. So, in conclusion, James Smetham was a gifted artist who produced a wide range of works and had moderate success, but never achieved his full potential. There were many reasons for this. The overriding reason was his mental state. It wasn't just the nervous breakdowns, because even when he was well, he was evidently an extremely nervy person who found social intercourse difficult and had to resort to obsessive practices in order to keep his sanity. The particular form of Methodism he espoused was a great comfort to him in many ways and provided him with a loyal set of patrons, but it inhibited his ability to become part of the art world. Nevertheless, he did arouse the admiration of Dante Gabriel Rossetti and his circle. Rossetti was a good friend to Smetham. He once told Smetham that he wasn't sufficiently ambitious, but it could be argued that Rossetti actually encouraged Smetham to be too ambitious and therefore reluctant to settle down to one kind of painting in what the unsympathetic critic called the humbler walks of art. As a whole, his life was a tragedy, but it also produced many solid achievements, including many paintings and prints that we can enjoy today. Thank you for listening.